was called socialist realism. Now, socialist realism is a style of art that glorified Stalin and what he stood for, which was socialism and his way of how he believed society should be. So, everyone gets equal pay, everyone is treated fairly and equally, and all music and art should say, wow, isn't this great? Aren't we all so happy that we live under this great guy, Stalin? And of course, that wasn't really what happened. All of the rules the Russian artists had to abide by was also the case for all of the Polish artists. What they had to do was say, wow, isn't it great? We live in such a wonderful time. We're so glad that Stalin is our dictator. This wasn't how people felt. However, if you wrote any music that kind of sounded like, I'm sad, the politics is a mess, my city is a mess, my life is a mess, I don't like it, you were out. Bacewicz wrote in her letters to her brother Vytautas, who lived in America by this point, that a lot of her friends had been imprisoned, she hadn't heard from them, they were taken away by authorities and they were never seen again. One of Bacewicz's closer colleagues, Andrzej Panufnik, is a great example of the kind of thing that happened. He wrote several pieces that sounded like I'm sad, because he was. The main one being Lullaby for orchestra. It's an incredible piece, it's a great listen. I mean, a lullaby is what you sing to children in order to get to sleep, so it should be relaxing, it should be beautiful, and it is. Most of it is. But then you've also got these sliding strings in the background that kind of give it this apocalyptic feel. It's like you're lulling a baby to sleep surrounded by what they were surrounded by. And needless to say, the authorities did not like this. He was given a lot of trouble, he was threatened, he managed to escape to England and lived there for the rest of his life. However, for the few years after Lullaby was written, when he was still living in Poland, he was only really allowed to write very patriotic pieces, marches, songs saying, hooray, we love this, and things like that. Bacewicz managed to avoid any kind of trouble. A question preempting what we will talk about later. Is this because she was a woman? Did no one take her seriously enough to believe that she could actually gain enough fame in order to influence people with her music that didn't sound like, oh, I'm sad, even though she was, because everyone was, but you get my point. Interesting question. Simmer that away. Think about it for a bit. One of the things Bacewicz did in order to get around the parameters set by socialist realism was to incorporate folk music into her music. Many of the Polish dances, mazurkas, which were more popular in the time of Chopin and Maria Szymanowska, are the kind of thing that she would incorporate, although she generally favoured the oberek and other such pieces. She would set these folk dances and folk ideas with the kind of French style that she'd been taught, the influence of Szymanowski, as well as this kind of raw sound of the violin. She wrote predominantly for string instruments and string music, although there are other pieces, as we've already said, wind quintet. This is because she was the most extraordinary violinist. She also played the cello and the piano to an incredible standard, but because of her really in-depth knowledge of the string instruments, she managed to squeeze out so much colour and so much control, timbre and expression that nobody else was doing, and I don't really think anyone's done since. She continued performing as well as composing. She won several awards for her 4th string quartet, her 6th string quartet. She toured Poland and Europe performing concertos by herself, by Szymanowski. Countless recital programs exist of hers where she plays Glinka, Bach, you name it. She was pretty unstoppable, and it didn't really matter what she did. Nobody could really challenge her and what she was doing in terms of socialist realism, but also in terms of her being a woman. As I said, one of her main colleagues was Andrzej Panufnik. He wrote very different music to Bacewicz, and the other main one was Witold Lutosławski. It is these composers, along with the later born Henryk Górecki and Krzysztof Penderecki, who managed to form what is later called the Polish school of sonorism. Now, Stalin was dead by this point. Socialist realism was not kind of forced upon these composers, yet because it had been, they'd been left behind, and the rest of Europe had just flung themselves into electronic music, post-serialist technique, etc. They were off away, and the Polish school was stuck thinking, well, we didn't really get the chance to explore that, but we have our own sound now, and we should really be pushing this instead of trying to jump on a bandwagon a bit too late. So what sonorism focuses on is timbre and texture in order to create sound. Sonorism literally means sound, and it's less kind of, here is your melody, here is your harmony, etc., but it's more to do with the sound as a whole and the effect as a whole. The easiest example of sonorism that we can look at is Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. It wasn't originally called this, which is interesting because the title really makes the piece. It was given some kind of mathematical title that I can't remember. So if I play a clip for you now, I want you to think about for a minute what it sounds like. So, it sounds like screaming people, and this isn't created by a kind of, it's a melody that sounds sad and then you've got this kind of underlying rhythm of pain, distraught, or anything like that. It's all about the textures and the timbres to create the one sound that Penderecki was really going for. So this is the kind of thing that Bacewicz was doing later on in her career. The pieces to listen to that really work in this way are music for strings, trumpets and percussion, Pensieri Notturni, and her later violin concertos, mostly number 7 and the viola concerto. Notice how different sounds emerge from rings that are already there, kind of going, and then you kind of like comes out of it, and it's all about the sound, the development of the sound and the overall effect, as opposed to a more foreground, background perspective. Later in her life, Bacewicz was one of the professors of composition at the Academy of Music in Łódź. The Academy of Music has since been named after her and her brother, and she continued teaching, composing, and less so performing until her death in 1969. She died a bit prematurely because she was in a car crash that broke her pelvis and gave her a lot of health problems after. Even though the crash didn't kill her directly, it did affect her health later on in her life. She was nicknamed the First Lady of Polish music and remains a very predominant composer in Poland. However, have we heard of her here? No! This is one of the things that really gets me. She is arguably one of the most, well, no, not even arguably, she's one of the most influential composers of the early 20th century, and we don't really know about her, and nobody can say her name for a start. Bacewicz, like vampire bat, Bacewicz. She won 24 Composition and Lifetime Achievement Awards throughout her life for not only being an amazing performer, composer, but also an incredible person. So many accounts by people who knew her, Lutosławski in particular, talk about how wonderful she was, how kind and how humble she was, despite the fact she was one of the most incredibly talented people. None of it went to her head, but she still stood her ground. How many pictures of her exist, of her surrounded by men, her at events where there are maybe wives of other people floating around, but nobody actually on these adjudicating panels or in these competitions who are also women. It infuriates me, because I find her incredibly influential. I just went to this Academy of Music in Łódź, not even knowing who Grażyna and Bacewicz were, and I was just completely astounded. I was like, oh my god, there's this woman composer who just triumphs over everyone, and it's absolutely incredible, and I've never heard of her. Why have I never heard of her? Who knows? Blame the education system. So that's a very, very simple lowdown on Bacewicz's life. Now I'm going to look at the effects of gender and genre on her work.